Bakhmut, Ukraine. Bakhmut is one of the oldest industrial cities in eastern Ukraine and known as the center of the salt industry. This 400-year-old city has been the primary focus of Russia's war effort since last spring and has gradually come under Russian and Wagner forces' control. Considered one of the bloodiest conflicts of the war, today it is a charred ghost town. A Ukrainian novelist who served on the front lines of the war wrote a story in last month's Sunday New York Times entitled, "I spent 5 days in a ditch waiting for death. It was pure hell." Perhaps you read it. Given the task of protecting a combat position on the outskirts of the city, the article tells the human drama of the unit he commanded while he was in the trenches. 10 miles from the Russian front line, he and his unit were the sentry, the outlook for snipers, invading drones, and enemy attacks. For 5 days, he lay in a 4-foot deep hole, a trench, wincing at explosions, and then the endless buzzing sound of drones while protecting his head from falling branches sheared by shellings. All around were the wounded, the wasted, and the pungent, sour smell of the dead. Often he had asked himself, do I really want to fight? Do I want to die? Do I really want to be held accountable for the blood of those I do not forewarn when the enemy strikes? Yet, somehow, he knew the answer. How could he not pick up arms and fight? Or maybe not. The role of a sentry, a watchman, has been around from early times. For example, in ancient Israel, as harvest time drew near, landlords hired guards to protect their crops against thieves. They would even put up a stone tower for better view of their crops. Cities had walls with sentinels and guard towers to protect inhabitants from raiders. Now, if you've ever been to the biblical Jerusalem, the Tower of David, also known as the Jerusalem Citadel, is an ancient citadel located near the Jaffa Gate, the western entrance to the Old City. Originally built in the 2nd century BC during King Herod's time, its purpose was to strategically strengthen the city's defenses, protect pilgrims from the menace of highway robbers, and watch for foreign invaders. Sentries were posted in the tower with one charge: to be on watch. The life of a sentry. This is where we meet the prophet Ezekiel in our first reading. Recall, Ezekiel spent his life in exile in Babylonia after the destruction of the first temple some 600 years before Christ. Ezekiel describes his call from God as a sentry, a watchman for the house of Israel. His business was the spiritual well-being of his community. His role was to make very clear to the Jewish people the seriousness of failing to turn from evil and to pursue the way of righteousness. And get this, God warned Ezekiel that if he did not faithfully blow his trumpet and warn of the punishment for not following God, Ezekiel himself would be held accountable for the blood of those who died for their sins. Like the Ukrainian sentinel, Ezekiel too did not want blood on his hands, so he steadfastly followed God's instructions. Ezekiel's depiction of the prophet as a watchman is a prelude to today's gospel story, which speaks of community building and social discourse. In Matthew, Jesus insists that it's not enough for Christians to mind their own business. Called to be faithful witnesses, the mutual concern of the church community is everyone's business. Jesus instructs his followers how to help each other stay on the right track. Each disciple is to be the watch person, per se, and be responsible for the spiritual well-being of the entire community. And what are we to be on watch for? Matthew is concerned about the mutual destruction of sins as the entire community suffers from the sinfulness of one of its members. So what are some examples of serious social sins that is destructive to the community? Oh, well, cheating, dishonesty, and failure to fulfill business obligations. The marginalization of groups such as ignoring the voice of women and discounting the elderly. Social media hate is a sin that our children and grandchildren are being raised in, conditioned to, and experience daily. Other sin destructive of the church's fellowship may be economic in nature. In Corinthians, Paul speaks about members of the church suing one another in civil court rather than arbitrating such cases within the community. In Thessalonians, Paul speaks about the sin of people freeloading and who refuse to work but are happy to eat what other people buy. Doesn't this sound like some of the current events, such as the collapse of public order on our American streets? All are roots of evil that cause destruction and bind us to this earth. Because of our human condition, sin will always be present. So like Ezekiel, we are called to be a watch person of others in our community. And how are we to respond when we observe destructive behaviors? Ignore it. Turn the other cheek. Oh, I got a better one. I know, perhaps just let it fester, or we'll excommunicate them. No, not really. As we embrace our baptismal role of priest, prophet, and king, the spirit of today's gospel encourages us to unite with others and deal with matters in a most charitable way. We're to find the true presence of Christ in others versus finding fault with one's blind spots. Indeed, we hold accountable and bind one another when we then stand up against destructive sins and release the bonds of guilt, anger, and bitterness. When we do these things, we align ourselves with God's values of forgiveness, justice, and participate in the work of reconciliation that God so desires of us. Same too when we loose things on earth for the good of our community. Forgiveness, grace, and compassion is extended. Both the Ukrainian novelist Century and Ezekiel chose the better path and took upon themselves the role of watchmen for their people, their community. Should this not be the same role we choose for our faith-based community?
At this time, I have the distinct honor of inviting Mike and Kathy to come forward.